بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. The series we've been looking at, particularly on the subject of rape, both outside marriage and the subject of rape inside marriage. And we'll come back to the question of the terminology. And related to this subject area of family issues is the question of forced marriage. I want to first start by underscoring the importance that Sharia, or the Islamic way of life, gives the family, and why we have taken some of these important topics as those worthy of discussing, not just because there's a lot of silence around them. Scholars have discussed these topics, but unfortunately to many in the general public, some of that information has not been easily accessible. So part of my role is really just to represent what scholars have already discussed and how scholars have approached these, both scholars of the past for past issues and contemporary scholars for those topics that have a greater contemporary relevance, because some of these topics are coming to the fore, especially in our current contexts. Firstly, I want to start by saying Sharia and the Islamic way of life gives tremendous importance to the subject of family. And so the topics surrounding marriage, divorce, child custody, rights and responsibilities, that whole subject down to inheritance, all of these subjects are of paramount importance in Islamic jurisprudence, such that there is a lot of discussion. But the opinions of scholars have spanned over 1,400 years of discussions from the time of the Prophet and the companions, and the building of Islamic jurisprudence based on the teachings of the Quran and Sunnah, but also respectful of the various traditions and cultures of people that have served them well. We should remember that culture, or what is called urf, is actually one of the sources of legislation and laws in Islamic jurisprudence. Consequently, we find a diversity of laws that suit various contexts. The big problem that comes sometimes is when contexts change and cultures change, but some of the rulings persist, and some of these rulings become unfair as they move from one context to another. Inshallah, we would start by mentioning that the preservation of family and family ties and the rights within the family are of considerable importance, such that what within the maqasid of Sharia, what the scholars describe as the daruriyat khamsa, the five essentials, the subject of ird, the subject of dignity of both husband and wife, of human beings as a whole, of children, is something that is of critical importance. This is an area of priority when it comes to the protection of the rights there, the enhancement of family values, the freedoms and the rights that accrue as a result of this institution, which is the most important fundamental institution for the upbringing of the most fragile, most vulnerable of our species, in other words, children. Consequently, the protection of lineage, the protection of progeny, of nasl and nasab, as it's described by scholars, is critical and one of those essentials. In fact, Ibn Ashur, in his classification of the maqasid of Sharia, the objectives of Sharia, put these together under the hifdul al, the hifd, or the preservation and promotion of family and the values related to that. For the purpose of this brief discussion on this topic, inshallah, I will start with forced marriage, the subject of ijbar, and then go to the topic of sexual violence within marriage, or what is often described as marital rape, which for some is a very controversial term, and we will inshallah look at that more closely. Firstly, in the question of forced marriage, I'd like to start by distinguishing three major forms of marriage, and there's always overlap in these type of classifications. One is what some describe as love marriage, where somebody goes, identifies somebody they want to marry, a male or a female, whoever it is that is doing the searching, and at the end of it, you choose who you want to get married to. Friends may recommend, online sites may recommend, family may recommend. So that is one type of marriage which is becoming more and more popular. But as we've seen from global trends, it actually has quite a very high divorce rate, ranging, depending on the country, from about 20 to 50% divorce rates when it comes to this type of marriage. Some of the most successful marriages historically and even today have been arranged marriages. Arranged marriage is not forced marriage. Arranged marriage is where people who know you, usually it's the family unit, based on their own knowledge of yourself and others, would arrange and propose who should be married to you, but they give you the choice to say yes or no. So this is where the family plays a significant role in the decision making of the qualities to be identified, that they allow the couple who are getting married, the bride and groom, the man and the woman, to have the ultimate say of yes or no. Globally, depending on the country, arranged marriages have a divorce rate of between 3 and usually the maximum is about 7 or 8%. Average actually being around 4 or 5% divorce rates when it comes to arranged marriages. Forced marriage is where the consent of those getting married is not sought, or even where it is sought, it is put aside, it is disregarded. And the man or woman is forced to marry somebody against their will. Usually, it is the woman, but men being forced into marriage is very rampant. I personally, in discussions with people who have come with marital problems, find that many men were forced to marry someone against their will. Sometimes it is the father or the mother, sometimes it is the grandmother or grandfather that is insisting that this man or this woman should be or must be married to someone else. So the key point I want to touch on here is both men and women get forced into this type of forced marriage, but women are usually the biggest victims of this type of situation. There are many consequences, and with all the kind of logic that some try to present, and we will look at some of the reasons why some people have opted or have decided to force their children or grandchildren into marriage. First, I would like to make it clear that forced marriage, what is called ijbar, has no basis in any explicit verse of the Quran or Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. The reasoning is more a product of ijtihad, where some scholars, particularly coming from the Maliki school, have felt that forcing a woman to get married may be what is in her best interest. And we will look again at that logic. What we have when it comes from the Quran and the Sunnah has been the Quran firstly describing marriage in Surah An-Nisa in Quran chapter 4 verse 21 as mithaqun ghalidan, that it's a solemn covenant, it's a solemn contract, it's a pact, it's an agreement between the two parties that are getting married. This assumes, therefore, that the Quran understands marriage is between the two people who are getting into the contract, and these are the two people who have the right to get in, and these are the same two people that have a right to get out of it if any of them feels, for whatever reason, that they are not getting what they came into the marriage for, or they find that the marriage has become an abusive relationship, a hellhole for some instead of the heaven or bed of roses they were expecting, but particularly where they feel their rights are being abused and violated. When we look at the problems of forced marriage, yes, there has been a gradual change in times, and as women get more educated, as they get more assertive, they are able to take their cases to court, and most courts handle these things quite simply, where the judge then becomes the wali and decides where they find the father or whoever is the guardian being irresponsible when it comes to the choice in marriage. Of course, we have had a lot of Muslim scholars talking in this area, more civil society organizations, Muslim NGOs and others interested in greater fairness, egalitarian, more healthier relationships within marriage, and trying to ensure that marriage always is a home of peace, of serenity, of justice, but doesn't become something that is detrimental to the quality of children that come out, because that becomes a big problem for society, and consequently, the law and society should be very concerned and interested in what goes on in the family, because that is the unit, that is the cell from which the new citizens are being groomed. That's the first school of the home. The other thing is, we have a verse in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah chapter 2 verse 232 where Allah makes it clear that even for women who have been divorced, they shouldn't be prevented from getting remarried. If they are ready, if there's an agreement between the husband and the wife or the couple, and it is legitimate, there's no harm involved, people should not be obstacles to marriage. Islam is pro-marriage, not anti-marriage. And so as long as you are sure that this marriage is healthy, you should support it. It's only if you find that it's abusive and somebody is being exploited and oppressed, then we should play a role in trying to right the wrong. And the Prophet ﷺ made it clear, whoever sees something wrong should correct it. Change it with your hand. If you can't, then with your tongue. If you can't, then with your heart. So we should do the best we can to change anything that we see wrong in marriage, in any situation. Why? Because there's usually a victim that needs rahmah. There's a victim that needs compassion from society and needs justice to ensure that it is corrected and not perpetuated, nor should people feel they can carry on abusing others with impunity and no consequence. We have numerous hadith. In the books of fiqh, in the six generally recognized authentic collections, hadith in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim, in Tirmidhi, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah and Nasa'i, these books, numerous hadith of the Prophet making it abundantly clear that women must be, the permission of women must be sought before their marriage contract is considered valid. Otherwise, it is null and void. And the numerous hadith make the same requirement, put the same requirement to widows, to divorcees, and to those who have not been married, to virgins or those who have not been married, that you cannot force a woman to marry someone contrary to her will, against her will. And so the Prophet made it clear that a matron or a woman who has been married before but is either widowed or divorced, her permission must be sought. And for a virgin, her consent must be sought. Otherwise, it is null and void. But in the hadith, one of the companions who asked, even the virgin, because some of them may be shy. And the Prophet said in that context, then her silent would be considered, that if she's shy, her silent would be considered her consent. However, she must know about it. And only if it is clear that her shyness or not speaking is because she is shy in particular cultures, to say yes, then it would be taken that the silence is consent. Otherwise, the understanding of all the major schools of thought, the Hanafi, school, the Shafi school, and the Maliki school, the Hanbali school, is that the woman's consent must be sought. So they all agree on the matron with no exception, including the Maliki. Where they start to differ is when it is a virgin. That's where some among the Maliki differ. So there's a difference of opinion within the Maliki school, and a difference between those scholars and the rest of the schools of thought, where some view that ijbar is permissible, that the father or the guardian has the overruling authority and power to force a girl into marriage. Even when those scholars made that provision, and this is important, they made it where they thought the father or the guardian would exercise that if he felt that was really in the best interest of the child or of the daughter. And the question here, the argument other scholars say, is where you have an adult daughter, sensible, who can sell her own property, she can decide about her life, who would know best what is in her interest? Who would know better than her? And since the Prophet made it clear that her consent should be sought, that should be the default position. And no one can say they know what is in the best interest of someone when, for the girl to be made to marry somebody contrary to her will, is to her an abuse of her right. That is not in her best interest. Consequently, the majority of scholars and the majority of judges across the Muslim world have recognized you cannot force a girl into marriage. Where we have a loophole in this issue, and it's partly a loophole in another way it's not, is when it comes to the marriage to minors. Before Islam and for most of Islamic history, as for most of the history of the world, the age at which girls get married was usually left to the family. It wasn't for the state to put a minimum age for marriage. That's a more contemporary issue over the last century, and depending on the countries, over the last 2 centuries or so, where a minimum age for marriage has been prescribed in different societies. So some societies would put a minimum age for men and women at the age of 20, in some it's 18, in some it's 16, 14, some just leave it unregulated and leave it to the family to decide. And so for most of history, across the world, age was left to family to decide. However, in different nations, and we will come to this topic more carefully in one of our next discussions, where we look at how and why Muslim scholars in different countries and in various nations have decided to put a minimum age for marriage. But since we're trying to understand where scholars of the past came from on this subject of forced marriage, because the age at which a woman got married was left to the family, it was therefore understood that if a minor is married to a man, they all understand it is a marriage. However, they also understand, based on the sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that there is no consummation of the marriage. There's no sexual relations until after puberty. And so when the scholars say a girl has been married before they reach the age of puberty, what they are simply saying is, this girl is married to this person and therefore cannot be married to somebody else. But because she was married, or that contract was done when she was still at an age she couldn't decide, in a way that was forced marriage. Even if she said yes and she's okay with it, she's too young for her opinion to actually matter. And so it is understood, therefore, that the authority that the father or the guardian wields and uses to conduct that marriage is a marriage without the consent of the girl. So the marriage is still considered a valid marriage. However, all the schools recognize 2 other things. One, they recognize that at the age of puberty, the girl's consent must be sought. In other words, while they agree that the marriage contract can be done before the age of puberty, they also recognize that once she has reached the age of puberty, her consent is needed before she starts agreeing for the marriage to be consummated for any sexual relations. So that is one area. And in the Maliki school, even where there's the opinion that a girl can be forced into marriage, what's interesting is, in the Maliki school, the woman has the right of khulu. Khulu is the form of divorce where a woman can get a divorce even if she has no reason other than she just doesn't want the marriage. So if a woman goes to a court in Maliki jurisprudence and says she wants a divorce, and if she's asked why, and she just says personal reasons that I do not want to present, she has the right and support of the judge, or should I say, of a knowledgeable judge. Because this was done during the time of Umar, it was done during the time of Uthman, where the husband was against, but the wife wanted it, and the wife did not express the real or full reasons, but Umar agreed to the divorce, even though the husband was against it. This is different in some of the other schools who view talaq as the overriding form of divorce and view khulu as a form of talaq. In other words, the other schools view khulu, the woman's right for divorce, as still needing the husband's permission. Or it will have to go to court to be settled by a judge, and in some schools, even the judge doesn't have the right to enforce the divorce. It still needs the husband's permission, in spite of a hadith of Thabit bin Qais on this issue, where his wife wanted a divorce, and she didn't give too many reasons, other than in some versions, she didn't find her husband attractive, and she didn't want to do anything wrong. She didn't want to harm him or deny him any of his rights. She didn't want to commit any sins in that regard. And she wanted a divorce. And the Prophet ﷺ went and asked the husband to accept her demands, and he did. Now, some understand the Prophet, like in the Maliki, some understand the Prophet as having fulfilled that role in his capacity as a judge. In other words, he was ordering the husband, and the husband didn't have a choice there. Some of the other schools view the Prophet as just having advised the husband. So there's a technical area of interpretation there, where the Malikis look at khulu as the right of the wife and the judge as the instrument for ensuring it is carried out. Other schools differ. However, the reason why I'm mentioning this is, those other schools, like the Shafi, Hanafi, and the Hanbali schools, who automatically recognize that if the wife says no, it is no. This topic of forced marriage is not a big issue from the jurisprudential Islamic legal point of view. There are cultures that will continue to do it and violate the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and the teachings of the Quran, and we will look at how to handle those. But on the side of Islamic jurisprudence, the other schools don't have a big issue on this subject area. In the Maliki school of thought, where some scholars still hold that opinion and have held that opinion, that is the school where, when the woman reaches the age of puberty, even if you say you don't recognize her consent and she must get married, it is the same school that gives the woman the right to get a divorce even if the husband doesn't want. So there you have what you call a legal space that the woman can take advantage of if she is forced. And what is interesting is, if in the Maliki school she is forced to marry, and even if the judge says the marriage is recognized, and then she says, but I want a divorce, and the judge recognizes her right for a divorce, if she is divorced, then like a divorcee, her authority goes up. The power of her guardian to disagree with her, to force her, evaporates. So this is an area where, whether within the Maliki or the other schools, you do have leeway within Islamic jurisprudence to ensure that a woman does not remain in a marriage she does not like. When it comes to the subject of moving forward, understanding the causes of this problem, because it's quite prevalent, unfortunately, in various societies, and especially in ours. And I would like to touch on both what the problem is so that we understand the depth of this challenge. One, you've got a problem, which I'm sure is obvious, of tribalism. And certain tribes just don't trust marrying from other tribes. They have all sorts of stereotypes. Some of them may be true, many may not be, but definitely you cannot say a stereotype is true for every individual. Some tribes are known to take marriage very lightly. They easily divorce, but they also easily get remarried. In some other tribes, divorce is a bigger stigma, and getting remarried is more difficult. And so people from one tribe have difficulty in accepting marriages in another tribe. And so even when the girl has fallen in love with somebody and there's a good gentleman, the tribe and the family sometimes can come in the way of what would otherwise be a very healthy marriage. So sometimes you have that tribalism, and no, you must marry from our tribe, and she's forced to marry somebody she either didn't want or had her choice seriously restricted. In some places, it is people in the village who have sent their children to go and study to school. The girl gets a good education, but it is come back home to marry, and you find a girl with straight A's, excellent grades in her secondary school, ready to start going into university, marrying an illiterate farmer, and having to live with somebody she really did not want to be with. And this, again, I think, touches on the need for us to seriously take the education of rural men as importantly as rural women. Otherwise, you get these very well-educated girls who, yes, education is good for her, but the society loses out on girls. And we've got cases of girls who they've memorized a lot of Quran, they've gone to Islamic schools in town, but the family is in the village, and at the end of all her education, she knows her deen, she knows her religion, she knows she's educated, she's ready to go to university, but she ends up in a very unfortunate context back in a rural area when she could have done more for society and for her family and for herself. The other problem we have is the culture of betrothal, where you find friends among parents promising each other, don't worry, my son will marry your daughter, and that's a promise that the father wants to keep. And sometimes the daughter may be interested in marrying the son, but the son doesn't want to marry. But because his father has promised him, or the grandfather promised, one of our children will marry from this family, and we find this sometimes within royalty. And this is not new. In most families that were of traditional leaders and royalty across the world, their choice for marriage was usually restricted to marrying within certain families. And there was always arranged marriages, and sometimes it was forced. Most of the time it was not forced, it was understood the person was actually prepared for it. But sometimes you find that happening in ordinary families where people have promised. Sometimes there's an issue of indebtedness, where I borrowed money, I'm in debt, and I want to pay back the debt, and this person wants his debt paid back in the form of marriage to my daughter. So you find that happening, and it's tied to poverty. One of the other problems, which is also tied to poverty, is where in some cultures, one form of dowry is in the form of payment. So this elderly fellow gets young men to come and work on his farm, and this friend gets his friends to work on the farm, and the refund is in the marriage to a daughter. In other words, it's another form of really commodifying the woman and treating her as property. And that is in compensation for the work that took place on the farm. A lot of horrible things go on, and threats of disownment if you don't do what your parents want. Sometimes the wife is threatened with divorce. Sometimes the daughter is afraid that if she says no to this marriage, because her mother is on her side, which is usually actually the case, though not always, and because the father may divorce the wife, then she says yes to the forced marriage and the will of the father, really just to keep the marriage and keep her mother happy. Sometimes you have a problem of guilt being put on the daughter. Who do you think loves you more, me or that other man? And she, is made to feel guilty for not going with the wishes. Sometimes the problem of power distance. In some customs and some cultures, the children are brought to respect their parents, but brought up to respect their parents to a level of fear that any form of disagreement, any form of non-compliance is viewed as disrespectful. And this is where sometimes the family comes in, the extended family comes in, and some of these honor cultures or cultures that have this power distance have a serious problem when the girls want to say no and they don't know who to speak to. Now sometimes she can grumble to her mother or to her uncle or to an auntie or a cousin, and there's usually some root, but sometimes there isn't. Sometimes there's this alpha father or alpha grandfather, the head of the clan, who says yes, and nobody wants to go against his will. Nobody wants to even raise it. And sometimes it's the alpha female. It's the grandmother who says yes, and her son, and everybody's like, we can't upset her. And you hear things like her dying wish, which is a very selfish wish if it is not really in the best interest of the child, and it's just in the interest of you and a promise you made to your friend, or some other unreasonable thing that should not have been honored, but in the spirit of loyalty to a promise. A life of a girl is messed up, or the life of a boy is messed up. Part of the problem also you find is ignorance of not just Islamic teachings. Some don't care about that, but also ignorance of the law. Some don't know, and many girls don't know, that if you actually took the case to court, you could get married to the person you wanted to get married, and you could get the judge to be your wali when you want, and the judge to nullify that marriage. And many courts offer this now. Of course, we still need education for some of our judges, but this is gradually changing, at least within the legal system. One challenge, of course, is the side effect of urbanization. And sometimes rural fathers and mothers get worried when their children go to town. They see what happened when the first son went to town. He got married in town. He never came back and seems not to care about the family, maybe because in town he doesn't even have a good job and he hardly sends anything back home. And so the family, for self-preservation, their own retirement plan, part of that package is to ensure that you get married. And so the guy goes to study, and while he's still studying, he's just been told the marriage has been conducted at home with you and some other person, and he has to take care of her, which makes it difficult for him to marry somebody in town. And this sometimes happens with first wife, and second wife is forced on the person, poor fellow. But unless issues to do with rural poverty, concern for rural poor is taken seriously by government, there will always be loopholes, traditions, people exploiting each other for economic reasons. The consequence of forced marriages, there are many. In some places, the woman gets pregnant and she aborts the child, and this is a very common thing. In some places, she is raped because she's against having sexual relations, and there's this forced sexual relations and abuse, something that she finds more humiliating than even being slapped or beaten, or property being destroyed. And we'll come to this subject more carefully soon. There's usually a lot more domestic violence, abuse, disregard for rights, psychological abuse in forced marriages. On the side of cooperation, the conflicts become more nasty. They don't take responsibility. The girl, when things go wrong, she doesn't look at it as anything she wanted. It's the fault of her parents. It's the fault of those who forced her into the relationship. And so she's not proactive. She doesn't usually take responsibility for things. It's all the fault of others. And one can understand she has this victimhoodness mentality. And when she has problems, who is she to talk to? The people who forced her into the marriage in the first place. And so these families become very nasty environments for the upbringing of children. We have cases where forced marriages have led to women eloping. When they hear you've been married to somebody you really don't love, she leaves the home, she runs off, and unfortunately ends up in all sorts of jobs to make ends meet. Some move into prostitution, some get just exploited elsewhere by others. It has led to nasty relationships where it ends in divorce. The family don't want the girl. Everybody is angry with everybody. Everybody is disappointed with others. How can we move forward? Of course, there's a lot that needs to be done, and so, like all of such challenges, they need to be approached in a more holistic manner. And these are you've got urban challenges, you've got rural challenges, you've got developmental challenges, economic challenges. A lot that needs to be done. In some countries, what they are trying to do to reduce some of these problems of forced marriages is to ensure that all marriages are registered with the courts, that the courts have a notary, imams who have been trained and who represent, not just any imam, imams who have been trained to represent the judge and who ensure there's a certificate for that marriage, who are there to see who is getting married, to ensure it's not forced marriage, to ensure that there's consent. So that has happened in a number of countries very successfully, such as Malaysia and many other countries, where you can't have a marriage without the judge knowing about it. You can't even have a divorce without the judge knowing about it. And this is part of Saddu Zaria. Blocking means that when left unchecked have resulted in abuse. Some describe it as Taqiyid al-Mubah, what is usually permissible but restricted. We find Umar, the second caliph, radiallahu anhu, when he noticed the right to divorce on 3 separate occasions was being abused and just repeated, and people were divorcing in an abusive manner, he restricted that freedom to divorce on 3 separate occasions and regarded 3 triple divorces at one instance as equal to 3. So we can have scholars who can ensure certification of marriages, ensuring the competence of those who are officiating marriages, to identify especially Juma imams, but those imams who are involved, so that they can become instruments of greater justice and prevention instead of cure, or at least identifying where people need this. And in trying to put it that the girl and the groom have to be seen, not just their representatives conducting the marriage in absentia, which is permissible, but in some schools this is a prerequisite. So some of these changes are required for Muslim scholars to be involved in new ijtihad. It's not actually new, it's just talfiq, it's just what's going on in other madhabs, what's going on in other schools of thought, what's going on in other countries, to see how we can solve our problems. Of course, this is an environment where even getting birth certificates for people in rural areas or small towns is a problem. So to start getting marriage certificates is a Herculean task, but it has to start somewhere. Even if it will start in some of the cities, some states, at least this is one area that other countries have taken seriously. Issues surrounding counseling, marital counseling, premarital counseling, counseling of parents, more talks on this subject area so that people know what really Islam teaches. The need for academic institutions, especially those studying sociology, anthropology, to start looking into family life. Let's get more data. What's really going on? What's going on in the area of abuse? What's going on in families? What's going on in forced marriages? What's going on where there's been triple divorce? Let's get more data of our own environment. You go online, it's really difficult to know what is the state of affairs. And so it's difficult to have the information that allows sound judgment in this regard. Education and literacy in this area, legal literacy for people, really important. More education of the general populace, better religious education, not just for the religious leaders, that is important. Traditional leaders need it because a lot of adjudication takes place at the local level before it comes to court. A lot of conflict resolution, alternative dispute resolution takes place at that stage. So more skills required lower down the societal ladders when it comes to solving the problem of rural people and urban and the poor in particular. The need to support cases of victims in court for free. That if they need a lawyer, they shouldn't have to pay for this type of thing. So more legal aid in this regard. The big problem, of course, the culture of standby, and this standby effect or bystander effect, where people just watch and want to mind their own business instead of when they see something wrong, they should change it. They try to leave it as, people's marital problems are their own affairs without recognizing that there's the kind of injustice that should not be tolerated, that people need help in this regard. Training of judges. Judges, very important, because when the chips are down, when people have to go for final answer, they usually go to the judges. In fact, in a discussion I was having with a judge before this presentation, I learned that sometimes the girls would actually bring a case to court just so that the judge educates the husband, because sometimes the husband just doesn't believe the woman is right, that she has the following rights, and sometimes the case is taken to court just so that the judge gets that type of information. However, it's at a risk of the embarrassment to the husband, to the family, and all of that, sometimes could threaten the marriage and lead to divorce. So it should be better, should be easier to get easier ways of educating people than having to go to court. So more stuff on media, more in the educational system, in helping people not just become good engineers and good farmers and doctors and accountants and all of that, but since everybody is eventually going to get married, let certain basic laws that are related to family be known by everyone. It's important that judges also understand this subject of khulu, the woman's right to divorce. What sometimes binds a woman is the culture and attitude of some judges. Because in the culture, when a man is getting married, he brings 10,000 naira, 50,000 naira, 100,000 naira and gives to the wife, but he also brings a sack of this, basket of fish, if I recall, all sorts of things that are part of the cultural requirements, boxes of clothing or cloth, sometimes even gold coins, depends on the culture. Finally, it's actually quite expensive. Because in khulu, where the woman is the one saying, I want a divorce, she's expected to refund either whole or usually just a part of it. Now, sometimes the husband says, I want the whole of what I was given. And this is where some judges, instead of finding out how much went to the wife, because that is what mahar is. Mahar in Islamic jurisprudence is the marital gift that goes to the wife. So it's usually an amount. Sometimes it doesn't have to be physical, it doesn't have to be financial or monetary, but it is what goes to the wife. And what the husband who is saying, give me back everything I spent on you and all of that, what the husband should be told is, wait a minute, wife, what came to you? What came to you personally? That is the mahar. That's what you refund. And husband, go and pursue the uncles and the mothers and everybody else for what went to them, since it was understood that sometimes nearly 80 or 90% of what is given actually goes to the family and the relatives and not the girl. The girl should not be bound and let her go and get all this from her relatives and satisfy her husband. No, let the husband go and get that from these others. So greater education of our Sharia court judges, and especially the senior judges, educating the junior judges, especially on these critical areas, is very critical. And the recognition of of harm as being more than just physical harm. The judges understand if you abuse your wife, if you are violent, if you hit in any way that is considered abusive or hard, that is an offense in Islamic law. But some don't add psychological abuse, financial abuse. They would recognize that a husband exposing the secrets of a wife, that's abuse. Insulting a husband, that is abuse. And to recognize that Sharia recognize that idrar, or this harm done in marriage, is broader than just physical. So to conclude on the subject of forced marriage, there is no basis for supporting it in the Quran or the Sunnah. It is the ijtihad and the juristic reasoning of some scholars that have tried to justify it in some circumstances, but even that is being abused because that is hardly ever done in the interest of the girl, which is when it is even recognized by some of these scholars as justified. However, it is still their ijtihad, and a later ijtihad and a later ijma can always override an earlier one if it is clear that what the Quran and Sunnah left on this topic, that you cannot force women into marriage, whether they are married, they were married before, or they have never been married, they have that consent. That's, I think, something we need to push more and try and see how to ensure not just the legal reforms, but the bigger job of getting the cultural, mental reform. Otherwise, where you don't have the right culture, ethics, etiquettes, norms, the laws become unenforceable. May Allah continue to help us in this regard. The next topic I would like to look at is the subject of marital rape. Now, for some, that sounds like an oxymoron. They cringe when you say marital rape for various reasons. And this is because of the loaded terminology rape. Not just rape is a crime. Classical rape, as everybody knows, is somebody who is not married raping or not married to a woman raping another woman. In other words, it is extramarital. It is non-consensual. The challenge some have with the terminology is that when it comes within marriage, marriage already assumes that the wife has a right to sexual relations with her husband, as the husband has a right to sexual relations with the wife. And the wife has a responsibility to make herself available for her husband, as the husband has a responsibility to make himself available to the wife. So it's a mutual right and mutual responsibility to sexually satisfy each other. This is assumed as soon as you say they are getting married. Everybody knows this is not a problem. This is something they both have a right to and a responsibility for. However, and the reason why I want to suggest that when discussing these topics with some, it's probably more useful to reduce the emotional baggage of the discussion by using terminologies that are less loaded. When you say marital rape, somebody starts saying to himself, marital rape, you mean the punishment that is to be given to that criminal robber, that individual is going to be given to a husband? Is this as severe as that? And so the consequences are actually coming in and affecting the discussion. If, however, you use other terminology like sexual violence within marriage, sexual abuse within marriage, or forced sex within marriage, some people would be more ready to, okay, yes, I see what you're talking about. Yes, it is wrong. Whereas the moment you say marital rape, it sometimes brings a knee-jerk reaction and it becomes a no more moving forward in the discussion, unfortunately. Having said that, and for the sake of moving forward, I would therefore recommend other terminology used. Having said for the sake of moving forward, I would also say that when what we mean by rape is an act, whether it is sexual or whether, excuse me, whether it is inserting something, and we now have a contemporary, more broader definition of rape that covers a man raping a man raping a woman raping a woman raping a man. So rape is broader, and in many definitions of rape, it's not actually just the private part of this one forcefully going into the private part of another. It is inserting anything, inserting a hand, inserting an instrument, inserting a gun, a knife, anything without the consent of the other person. So the key thing is that lack of consent. Having said that, for some it's not even necessarily to do with the sexual organ. When they use the word rape, it could be putting somebody's sexual organ into somebody else's mouth forcefully. It could be all sorts of ugly things. However, say rape in marriage, we seem to have no problem. And I think the part of the problem is associating the word rape and the criminality and the kind of punishment that comes with rape with family, married context. If, however, we say we are not comfortable with that word being applied to the family, we seem to have no problem calling murder as murder, even if it's the father who murdered the son, or a daughter who murdered a father, or within the marriage, murder is still murder. It may have a different punishment, may. You can have theft. Stealing is still stealing, whether you are married to the person or not. Stealing is still stealing. A son can steal from his father, a father can steal from his son. It's still stealing. It may be treated differently in court if the thing is taken to court, but it's still stealing. If you destroyed or vandalized somebody's property, or you destroyed somebody's property, it's still vandalization. If you insulted, it's still an insult. Just because it's a family member doesn't mean it's no more an insult. Gossip is gossip, whether it's family member or not. Violence is violence, whether it's a family member or not. So from that perspective, I honestly don't see a problem with describing marital rape as marital rape. However, this is not an academic exercise. More importantly, we want to solve a problem. And if terminology is going to get into our way, let's focus more into the kind of discourse and creating the kind of environment that allows us to progress. In fact, in Islamic, one of the Islamic legal maxims states that al-ibra fil uqud lil maqasid wal ma'ani la lil alfaz wal mabani. That the premise, the operating principle when it comes to relationships or contracts in Islam is to go with the meaning of things, the maqasid and the objectives, not with just the words or the phrases. In other words, what really matters is what's really going on, not what word we call it. So if the word rape or marital rape or rape in marriage is going to make it difficult for us to address the issue, I would suggest let's get another less emotive, less controversial word for the purpose of progress. Why? Because even those who have a problem with the word rape are still ready to recognize that violence can be conducted within sex in marriage. Firstly, I'd like to touch on the fact that scholars recognize the harm of sexual violence or forced sex within marriage. And this comes from various sources. You could look at it from the point of view of the maqasid of Sharia. One of the objectives of Sharia is hifdhul ird, the protection and enhancement of human dignity. And that forced sex is humiliating. It is putting a person down. It is denying them the right to their own person. When you can't even deny them the right to their own property, how can you deny them a right to their own person? When you can't snatch somebody's property from them, how can you snatch their honor? So they recognize that if it is humiliating, just as insulting is humiliating, just as any act that is culturally recognized as disrespectful is wrong within marriage, then forced sex is wrong. Why? Because it is not supporting the maqasid, actually it's going in the mafasid, it's creating a harm instead of a benefit that Sharia expects within the family. The objectives of family life, according to the Quran, are the promotion of mawadda, wa rahmah, and sakina, of love, of compassion, of tranquility. The Quran describes men and women as being like hunna libasun lakum, they are like your garments, like your clothing, and vice versa, wa antum libasun lahunna, that you are like garments for them. You protect each other just like garments. It protects your dignity, it covers your nakedness, it gives you warmth, it gives you a sense of security and peace and a source of honor. So anything that is going to go contrary to that. So when we look at the objectives of marriage as a whole, we find any form of forced sex in marriage goes contrary to the maqasid of Sharia, and therefore it is in line with the mafasid the harms that Sharia tries to stop, tries to prevent and protect people from. When we look at even what the Prophet taught regarding sexual relations are supposed to be pleasurable. They're supposed to be love-making within the family. They're supposed to enhance and improve relations. So much so that the Prophet ﷺ told the companions, you even have a reward. You have a reward when you have sex with your wives. You both have rewards. And there's like, how could it be rewarding when we are pleasurable? And he said, well, the opposite is a sin. And this is enhancing marriage. It's something that is good. You are avoiding a haram and using something that is halal. But even when it came to sex, the Prophet ﷺ went even further about sending a messenger, in other words, which was understood to be foreplay and prohibition of people timing each other like beasts. No foreplay, you start behaving like chickens. And you know how chickens do it. They run after each other and, basically it's rape. That's the way of life there. Maybe survival of the fittest, but that's not the human way. The Prophet juxtaposed how a Muslim should do it, how a decent person should do it, compared to how beasts or animals do it. It should be with foreplay. It should be to enhance love and compassion and an expression of love and compassion. That is the Sunnah. To behave like a beast, that is contrary to the Sunnah. And anybody trying to introduce that's a bid'ah, that is haram. When we look also at it from the qawaid of fiqh, the legal maxim, the spirit of Sharia, so you can look at it from the objectives of family, the objectives of human dignity. When you look at it, so in that sense, it's not enhancing, it's actually breaking family, it's abusive. When it comes to the qawaid, the maxims of Islamic jurisprudence, one of the first maxims is al-umur bi maqasidiha, that matters will be judged according to the purposes they fulfill. Al-umur bi maqasidiha. And we ask ourselves, what is normal sex, love making about? It's about making more love between the couple. It is about mutual satisfaction. It's sometimes about children, a lot about mutual pleasure and fulfilling each other's rights and, and making the best out of your company with each other if that's what you both want. What is the objective of forced sex within marriage? It is not about love. It's not about mutuality. It's not about give and take and, there's no sadaqah, there's no blessing in it. It's animalistic behavior. It is to humiliate. It is to trample on the dignity. And al-umur bi maqasidiha, matters will be judged based on what they fulfill, based on the purposes they fulfill. So if that form of forced sex or violent sex within marriage is to humiliate, then that is contrary to the maqasid of Sharia. It is haram for you to humiliate. It is haram to humiliate. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Allah says He has honored the children of Adam. You don't insult. A Muslim doesn't taunt. A Muslim doesn't insult. The Prophet ﷺ made that clear. Among the qawaid also of fiqh, the legal maxims which summarize the spirit of Sharia, is a maxim that says, La bayn hadith la darar wa la dirar. You don't harm nor reciprocate harm. The maxim says, ad-darar yuzal, that harm must be eliminated. And so scholars conclude the moment harm is being created, it must be eliminated. We must prevent it, we must cure it, but we can't get used to harm. Harm must be removed wherever we see or notice it. And so the simple question is, and it doesn't matter how the sex took place, the moment it is causing harm. Scholars in elaborating hadith regarding sexual relations would even say that even though a man is satisfied before his wife is, he should continue until she is also satisfied. So as marital counselors say, sometimes the man is like the light bulb, quick to heat up, quick to cool down. And the woman is like the iron, slow to heat and slow to cool down. And that husbands should recognize that sex is also a form of sadaqah, that you have to persevere, you have to go out of your way sometimes to ensure that your wife is pleased Just as sometimes, and sometimes probably more often, the wife ensures you are pleased even when she is not adequately satisfied. But there should be love, there should be compassion, there should be empathy. This is the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Moving like a beast on your wife is contrary to the sunnah. This is an innovation that is haram, it is unacceptable. And to try and justify it with the deen is bringing a counterfeit, something contrary to the religion of Islam, contrary to what marriage calls for, and trying to insert it. In no way can sexual violence within the marriage be justified. When we look at the way some try to understand it, and I'll come back to this question of whether forced sex within marriage is just a moral wrong, or whether it could be treated as a legal wrong. And just a point there, and I'll come back to this. Some look at it as the forced sex is only morally wrong, because somehow the agreement of marriage assumes you have a right to sexual pleasure. Of course, there's a question mark of whether this is about sexual pleasure or whether it's actually just power play and oppression and humiliation. But let's take it, yes, you have a right to sexual pleasure. So some view, therefore, it is morally wrong to forcefully have sex with your wife or vice versa, but not legally wrong. That what is legally wrong is the act of pinning her down, the act of violence that is accompanied by it. But just as she says no, but she cooperates anyway, or she doesn't resist, that is morally wrong, not legally wrong. And we will come back to this shortly, inshallah. When it comes, and I should say, even though I say I'll come back to it, that it is very often, therefore, up to the judge to decide the severity of the offense, what exactly was coupled with the forced sex. Was there any more violence? Was there hurting in any other way? Was there any damage? Anything else done? And some stop at that and want physical damage. Unfortunately, some don't expand the understanding of idrar and harm done to the wife to be more than the physical. Because she may find that other forms of abuse that are legally considered as haram and punishable are actually worse than forced sex. And she would consider that a bigger grounds for divorce. And so we'll come back to this shortly. Scholars agree it is wrong. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is it's not that some scholars say it's okay and others say it's not okay. No. It is simply, is it to be treated as a legal crime or not? And even those who say it is only morally wrong would say, but anything beyond that could be legal and could be considered a criminal act that the judge should look into and decide based on ta'zir, based on the discretion of the judge, the case, the severity of the harm, what kind of compensation, what kind of punishment, what the judge will decide whether it falls under qisas type of offense like injury or whether it is one of ta'zir that is left to the discretion of the judge. Some have tried to say that since the Quran has described your wives as being like your tilth, they are hilful lakum, they are like your farmlands, that somehow that therefore means you can go into your farm the way you want. That is not how the Prophet said. The Prophet made it clear. You go with foreplay. You go with ways of enticing, seducing each other, making it pleasurable. He made it very clear, because the metaphor of farm is used, no farmer in his right senses approaches his farm in a destructive way. You manage your farm in such a way that it is sustainable, that it will be taken good care of, that it will give you the fruits you're looking for. You manage it. There's a whole field of husbandry and agriculture, of how to take good care of the land, To just say because it's a farm, it means you just go and do anything you want. The Prophet made it very clear, you do not go to your wives the way animals go to each other. So to use that metaphor to try and justify it, you can't justify something contrary to the Sunnah using a warped understanding of a metaphor. Some have tried to say that there's a hadith where the Prophet made it clear that the angels would curse a woman who denies her husband sex until dawn. And therefore, since it is haram for her to deny her husband, means it is wrong for her to say she wouldn't give sex. And from that, they then conclude that therefore he can forcibly take it. Because you have a right to something doesn't justify you taking it by force. Because you have a responsibility for something doesn't mean you do it by force. The Prophet encouraged us to feed our wives. In fact, that if you put a morsel of food into the mouth of your wife out of love, you have a reward for that. Because you can put a mouthful doesn't mean you've got the right to force food into somebody's mouth. When it comes to this, firstly, the scholars also understand that this hadith should not be taken out of context of the whole Quran and other hadith that help us clarify and understand that there are sometimes valid reasons why a woman would say no. Not just because she's in her menstruation or she's sick, but other reasons that she knows that, look, I'm just not into it, and the husband should be considerate. You don't go and try to say, because I have a right, you're going to start damaging your relationship with your wife and damaging your marriage. You're not going to use the hadith that tells the wife to make herself available and say, because of that, you now have the right to behave like a beast, like an animal, and go and have forceful sex with your wife, whether she, without foreplay, no. The Quran makes it really clear. You either stay together in peace or you separate in kindness. Yeah. You either stay in ma'ruf, you either stay together with a good relationship, but if the relationship is, degenerating, before it gets too bad, separate before it is too late. Otherwise, once you separate, you'll have problems relating over children, over all sorts of other issues. But as Muslims, as human beings, you must keep your humanity. You don't degenerate to the level of the beast. And so we can't use this hadith to justify going contrary. You can't say, because I've been denied, then I'm going to do something wrong. But having said that, and making it really clear, yes, this hadith tells us and makes it clear that a woman should not deny a husband sex. In fact, it even goes as far as saying, in one statement, even if the request was made while they were both on top of a camel, like as inconvenient as it is. Of course, which husband would want to be on a camel if you've got the option of a bed? However, the lesson scholars have taken from this is, it is very, very hurtful to a husband to try and to make advances and be denied. And that is very hurtful to the family. The Prophet encouraged husbands that if you go out and you find another woman that's attractive, you didn't guard your gaze or whatever happened, the Quran didn't encourage you to go and marry her. No, the Prophet actually said, go back home, make love with your wife, that would remove that other person's thoughts or whatever you were fantasizing. So erase it and build a stronger relationship within the family. When we look at this issue of the mutual right to sexual relations, we realize that men have a right to sex and women have a right to sex. In fact, when you look at the generality of Islamic law, you find everything that is wrong for a man to do is wrong for a woman to do. Every right of a man is as important as the same mutual right of a woman. Gossip by the woman is just as bad as gossip to the man. And it has nothing to do with gender. Lying is bad for men as it is bad. It's not that if a man lies, it is worse than if a woman lies. If a man commits murder, it's exactly the same wrong as a woman who commits murder. If a man does zina, it's the same as a woman committing zina. If a man steals, if a man does any harm, it is as bad as the other. And just because, and we find, if it says gossip or backbiting is like eating the dead of your dead brother, it's not that the dead brother is worse than a dead sister. No. But just because it's used as that terminology, not to emphasize the gender, is to emphasize how bad it is. When it says a woman is married for 4 reasons, for her family, for her beauty, for her nobility, for her faith, etc., this is not to say a man is not married for the same type of reasons. And that the advice is, because we spoke only in the context of a woman is married for the following reason, doesn't mean that same advice doesn't apply to men. So we don't look at just the case that came to the Prophet, and the Prophet ﷺ expounded a moral teaching, and we want to restrict it to just that. Consequently, it is just as wrong, because that is the default in Sharia, that the wrong done is the same irrespective of who does it. And it is just as wrong for a woman to deny her husband sex as it is for a man to deny his woman or his wife sexual access. It is the same moral wrong. Back on, and the key point I just want to conclude as we summarize or come to the end of this discussion is that to say, therefore, that a man has a right to sexual relations, that in no way is the same as a right to humiliate, to oppress, using sex as an instrument. But the same thing the other way around. Just as some men do it, women weaponize sex and use it to try and negotiate. It's a very bad negotiating tool in marriage. And one would advise both men and women, never use sex. It is very deep in the hurt it causes others when they are denied. And anybody in marital counseling can tell you more about that. So on the issue of the wrong of rape, we cannot say it is justifiable under any circumstance to behave like a beast. So we can't say, because she denied me, that is wrong, I'm going to do something wrong. It's just unacceptable in Islam. And when such a wrong takes place, if the wife finds it is something too hurtful, she cannot bear, we would advise, as soon as you sense that, start getting counseling, start getting other ways to resolve the problem early enough, before it goes to court, before it reaches the level where any punishments come in, before it reaches the level where divorce may be considered an option in this regard. Ways forward, we need more marital counseling. We need more premarital counseling. We need more sex education in an appropriate way, at the right level, early within our educational system. This is an area I think religious scholars need to be more proactive, and the government needs to be more proactive in getting religious scholars to make appropriate forms of sex education available for various types of offenses, not just forced marital sex, or what some would call marital rape. The other problem that supports this marital rape or sex within marriage is forced marriages, where the husband, now that he has been made to marry this one who has been saying no, wants to now teach her a lesson, humiliate her, etc. So let us also try and kill more than one bird with one stone. By stopping forced marriages, you reduce the cases of marital rape. A big problem of marital rape, because, and forgive me for using the marital rape for those who are sensitive about it, but I hope you understand I'm using these words interchangeably, that for those who are involved, actually most women, or many women who are married, experience, and it's increasing, the amount of forced sex that is taking place in marriage, where the foreplay is very short, And the problem is very often due to pornography. Pornography has become another pandemic that has been heightened during lockdowns. Some people have gotten addicted to it. And what they want to do with their wives is what they watch on pornography. And it is killing the pleasure of sex for marriage. And more and more women are finding the sexual act really a form of pain. It's no more lovemaking. It's just the man wanting his own pleasure and doesn't care about how the wife feels or whether she's satisfied or not. Not just is pornography haram, but if you really want to care about your family, find ways of getting therapy, getting counseling, getting off some of these bad habits. Alcohol is another problem. Alcohol is already haram, but unfortunately, we have some people who, because they drink alcohol, they use it, they get into violence, they use that to punish the wife even more. Poor alternative dispute resolution methods, poor conflict management methods. As always, divorce, we try to make it a last resort, but divorce is not, marriage is not a relationship where peace at all costs. No. Where the objectives are being undermined, where a person is being abused, where children are going to grow up in an abused home, it is actually better to separate than to stay. And I'll conclude with the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said, it is better to be alone than to be in bad company, but it is better to be in good company than to be alone. On the subject of forced sex within marriage, marital rape, or sexual violence within marriage, it is haram, and depending on the victim, how severe it is, they can and should be able to take it to court, and judges should recognize that idrar, harm, can take place in the form of a sexual act that is not about lovemaking, but about abuse, oppression, and behaving really like a beast. And it's contrary to the Sunnah and the Maqasid of Sharia. I pray you forgive me for taking more time than I should and not having given the opportunity to respond to questions. I also pray that some of this presentation has responded to your questions. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you for your patience. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.